Today's episode is about something we don't always talk about openly: grief, loss, and how life changes when we lose someone we love. But it's also about something hopeful: resilience, meaning, and how the relationships we build can carry forward even after a loss. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Ryan Dunn from Weber State University. Ryan's research with young widows has led him to a powerful idea that the quality of a relationship can actually reach beyond the grave. It's a perspective that really shifts how we think about love, connection, and even how we show up in our relationships today. After earning a BS in exercise science and psychology from Utah State University, Dr. Dunn began a career in financial consulting. However, his passion for understanding families soon outshone his interest in financial markets, leading him back to USU for a PhD in family relations and human development. There, he focused on parenting, healthy relationships, family finance, human development, and grief and loss. Today, Ryan serves as the Department Chair of Child and Family Studies at Weber State University, where he teaches courses on lifespan development, stress management, research methods, and diverse families. Ryan married a cheerleader from a rival school, and together they have 6 pretty awesome creatures, children whose ages span from 2nd grade to the university. We hope you enjoy the show. Hey there, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Stronger Marriage Connection podcast. I'm Dr. Dave up here at Utah State University, typically alongside Dr. Liz Hale. She's out of town today, so we'll excuse her, but I'm excited to be talking about a topic that touches all of us at some point, but one we don't always feel comfortable talking about, and that is grief and loss and the changes that come with it. We'll also get into resilience, hope, and how people find their footing again after life shifts in really hard ways. I'm really grateful to have a good friend and colleague joining me, actually just down the road, it feels like, right down at Weber State University. Ryan Dunn, welcome to the show, my friend.
Hey, it's great to be here, Dave. This is exciting. And as you mentioned, I oftentimes talking to people about death and grief, they're like, that's a real macabre subject, but it's one of my favorites because of some principles that come out of it.
Really looking forward to this, Ryan, because we have not had a guest on the show about this important topic. So I think this will be something that will really resonate with many of our listeners. So excited to dive in. Hey, Ryan, before we jump into the bigger topic, I'd love for you just to give our listeners a little bit of your story, a little bit of the backstory. You know, what's your background? What led you to the work you're doing now at Weber State?
Well, it's a good question because I always use kind of the Rascal Flatts story to tell people that it's a broken road that led me straight to where I'm doing what I'm doing today. When I was an undergrad, I was up at Utah State and I was studying to be a physician. I wanted to follow kind of in Dad's footsteps, maybe a little bit different practice. But while there, studying psych and some exercise science, some other things that were of interest to me, I got to the end of my time and all I had left was the MedCat and to get into medical school. Some unfair advantages, you know, in Dad's world, he knew folks on the board down at the U. And I was somewhat of a shoo-in as I talked to the chairman of the board, and he made a recommendation, kind of changed things, kind of broke the road up a little bit, if you will. He said, between now and when you enter school, you know how when you do like a job application and they say, hey, between January and June, what did you do? And between July and December, what did you do? He said, do not have one of those open, I studied for the test or I sat around or whatever. He says, that is one thing I may not be able to speak over the rest of the board. They hate that. So he said, roof a house, learn how to flip pancakes better. He said, do something. And I thought to myself, in real quick succession, Dad had said, I'd always made a lot of money, Ryan, but I didn't ever manage it well. So I looked to kind of my recent past, my Little League baseball experience that had this super wealthy baseball coach who had extra time because of his job. He was a money manager. So I thought, I'm going to ask him, and for 6 months or a year, I'm going to learn how to manage money so that when I'm a doctor and I'm making it, I know how to manage it better. And I went and told him, I said, I'm not going to stick with you in these other things, but could I learn under your wing? Brought me in, and there we were. And you know what? I went into that, and there's a longer story short here, but Janelle and I kind of counseled on this. That's my wife. I stayed in finances for the better part of 10 to 15 years. Really enjoyed working with people, and I got to know them. Dave, I was in their homes and of course was making them a lot of money, and I enjoyed coming back year after year to show those balance sheets. but they'd have tragedies or they'd have celebrations, starting new businesses. I remember one young man, he went from making $60,000 a year to making $400,000 a year in the course of just a couple of years as he jumped off into making this. We celebrated his growth and development. But I then had some unexpected phone calls of a 35-year-old whose husband went out on a bike ride and never came home. Or, others who, after a long fight with cancer or unexpected other car accidents. And here I was meeting them where they needed me in the extremities. So some good, some hard. But I looked at my wife one day and I said, I should have studied people. I mean, I really like the market and how it moves to make money, but I like what the money's doing for people. I really should have studied people. And she really supported me and said, you'd be good at this. And so I went back up to Utah State, my alma mater, and I jumped in with a little bit of support from the admin there to say, where do you actually fit in? I said, I'd like to study people, and here's my background. Can you give me a chance? And I went into that program. And as a final note of that, how did I get to where I study grief? I found as we were talking about the stories of relationships, we were talking about development of family, of parenting, of getting ready for retirement, whatever it was, there was always this kind of interesting conversation that I could, in classes, use those conversations of the young widows or other things I had done as a financial advisor to make, anecdotally, to make points when we were talking theory or practice or whatever in mental health. And my teachers would pull me aside from time to time, and they said, Ryan, have you ever thought about studying that grief process? And I'm like, what are you talking about? They said, well, you default to it often, and you seem to have a real grasp for it. How about putting some science to some of that story and bringing it to life for people who might read and learn and grow from the research? And never having thought about that, I dug in more deeply. I sat down and did some early interviews with younger widows and realized there's a real passion in here. And as I mentioned earlier, some principles really helped it along. So from that point forward, I found a job down here at Weber and have been loving my work and teaching and, of course, doing research in those areas ever since.
Wow. And that is actually a pretty fascinating path. I mean, a pretty unique path as you wound around for medical and then finance and then people. I'm curious, Ryan, as you've studied loss and grief, and especially at unexpected times in life, what have you learned about what makes those experiences especially difficult or impactful?
Yeah. We tried to quantify, when you study something, I was explaining this to students earlier in the semester, a construct. It would be like saying I wanted to measure health. Of course, I could measure weight or something like that. And I could say you weigh 134 pounds. And then that's quantifiable. It's very easy. But health is difficult. It doesn't have a scale. So we did reach out and looked to the world who had measured this idea or construct of grief and created, if you will, a quantity to say my grief is good or my grief is bad. And I'm going to put those definitely, Dave, in air quotes, because I think for most of us, we recognize the pain associated with grief. But as an outcome, it isn't always bad. But we use the Texas Revised Inventory of Grief, and it gave us a path to run on, because this is great scale that has been tested over and over and used over and over again for a variety of losses, most appropriately and specifically in death of a loved one. But there are other things that someone loses, like our good friend Travis Dorsch. I've talked to him a lot about this because I have a younger brother who is a contemporary, and they both got out of professional sports. I mean, they were known as athletes. Like, that was their moniker from the time they were little kids all the way up until their late 20s. And then all of a sudden, for the first time in their life, where most of us had already experienced this, they were cut from a team. And I asked him about that grief of changing who he was and whatever. And it was the real deal. But using that revised inventory, because the language in there primarily captures loss, I went out to see what other things kind of sidled up to that experience or the score of grief, and found in a really long list of items that we utilized, especially in my dissertation research with young widows, what were the variables that most impacted the levels of grief? Now, coming at it from the vantage point of being a younger married father of small children, I thought Losing someone at a younger age is definitely going to have an impact. I mean, this is me theorizing. Or having children and having that loss, and now I'm a single parent. Or did they leave me money adequate to be able to take care of this? Or like some of my widows, Dave, like they buried their husbands on Saturday and they were looking for jobs at Wendy's on Monday. I mean, was those sorts of things. And I thought, for sure, this sort of thing is going to be what matters for the score, that grief score. And in the end, when we looked through all of it, the interesting thing that washed out is there were really three main areas. One was using Schramm and Schitt's work on the type of grieving that's taking place, or the coping mechanisms that follow after. They have this oscillation model, as opposed to like Kubler-Ross that says we go through stages like I go from freshman to sophomore to junior year of high school, I might be in denial or anger. The oscillation model looks like a really exciting ping pong game where it's like batting it back and forth between two kind of orientations. One is loss oriented. The other is restoration oriented. Restoration is there a way for me to kind of get on with my life, to move on with this loss, versus loss oriented is like I'm missing, I'm ruminating, I'm stewing over the things that I've gone. And the women who scored higher in the fact that like right here, right now, while I'm taking your survey, Ryan, I'm fairly loss oriented. I'm really kind of missing him and focused on those sorts of things. Quick aside, speaking of ping pong in my head, part of my data gathering stretch, Dave, was through Valentine's Day. And I hadn't even contemplated that until I started to read some of the things that were coming. Gratefully, it was stretched over a few months, but one of the women, graciously, as she was doing the open-ended responses, wrote back and said, seeing as it's Valentine's Day, this is really kind of painful to talk about this, but here I go. And I hadn't even thought, because it took so long for the IRB to approve it, the review board to give us permission to gather that data. As soon as it was available to me in early February, it was like, send it out. I want to get going and knowing more about it. But back to the story. I mean, surely the timing of it could have been, but I wanted to know right then, right there, where is your orientation? Are you focused on the past, or are you focused on the future? And those that were focused on the past, they tended to have higher grief scores, meaning the grief was having a higher impact on them. The second of the two is pretty simple and lined up with some of my preconceived theories, and that was the longer an individual had been in their relationship, they actually had a lower, it doesn't mean that the grief went away, but the score of their grief, it lessened over time. So someone who'd been married for 20 years commonly had a lower grief score than those that had been married for 2. The third one brings in kind of where, you and I talked about this a little bit a while back, is the individuals, speaking about reflecting on the past, but their intimate or their close relationship with their spouse tended to have kind of a buffering effect. Or in other words, the closer they rated their relationship with that sweetheart that was now gone, the lower their grief score. And though I think there's a lot to maybe address in that issue, it washed out just about everything else. Levels of education, religiosity, the power of the support system around them, is how close were they to that spouse when they lost. So all those things can have some complicating features, but those three tended to have the biggest impact.
Wow. Some of that is surprising, honestly, when you think, the closeness or the length of the relationship. Digging deeper, what do you think what was it? Is there something about that they're just, 20 years, 40 years, and they, I don't know, have a different perspective, I guess, over time, can change, I guess, how you see each other, or what's going on there?
That's an interesting question, and certainly I'll say this throughout, because I think some of this is just scratching the surface of what it might mean. In the West, we have an interesting philosophy that people around the world look at us and kind of point the finger and say, you're death deniers. We don't die at home with our families. We die in the hospital. We kind of scrub it. We trying to think of the word. We kind of keep it squeaky clean behind closed doors because it's not something that people talk about in kind conversations. Now, I was thinking about that very issue as I was looking forward to our chat today. And I thought, if you look at the box office and the movies that are coming out, you would think, no, Americans love death because horror movies and scary, those kinds of things. But I think we like that kind of antiseptic Hollywood version of it. Contemplating our own demise in some of those things has kind of pushed that away. But over time, as we've looked at people's, especially if we talk about the one item, as we move longer into our relationship, there could be two or three things being juggled at the same time in this. Why would it decrease with time? First and foremost, relationships have associated with them a commitment, not just between me and you, but a commitment to our future. And really great material. Gottman talks about this a lot, and others do, about this idea of allowing our partners to dream. Part of that is I'm dreaming with you. I mean, I could be dreaming about some business I'm going to start and some of those other things, but commonly even that is associated with having these relationships and so forth. And if we're new in our relationship, there's a ton of dreaming that I have on the books in my head or my heart that still is incomplete when I lose you. So whether it's a breakup or a death in this set of circumstances, there may be a degree to that as I'm living more of the future I had seen with you and I'm giving up less. Perhaps that helps in that grief score a little bit. But there are other aspects that I could speak to. And in short, I think bringing them into this conversation is that idea of a continuing bond. It may be that the younger ones, when having lost somebody, have more questions about, well, what would they do in this set of circumstances? Maybe they get to graduation with their kids and they want to know, should I pay for college or not? I really wish so-and-so was here. They were in charge of the money. Maybe there's more of those kinds of unsure about my partner if I only had so much time to build that knowledge and understanding of who they are and what they do. So,
yeah. Ryan, does that kind of touch upon one of the ideas that you shared that really has stuck with me is that the quality of the relationship can reach beyond the grave. I think that's powerful. Can you unpack what you've seen in your research with young widows that led you to that conclusion?
Yeah, that's a great point of this, and one that's fascinating and still curious to me. Klaas, Silverman, and Nigman talked about this idea of the continuing bond in the great book and movie, mind you. Most movies aren't anywhere near as good as the books. But Tuesdays with Morrie is one of those ones I would suggest is really good. He says that death ends a life, but it doesn't end a relationship. And I think that there's something to that. Now, the lingering effects, are they positive ones? That's something that I can carry with me, right? So if you think about great relationships like going away to work and having that fond thought about my spouse and carrying that with me, and it makes me happy, it makes me choose differently. I might even sit down to lunch and not have so many of those V8 moments. I'm actually making better choices because, the relationship extends beyond holding hands and hugs and kisses to when we're apart from each other. There may be some magnified version of this, or at least to some degree, persistent version of this, when an individual loses a spouse to death, as the fondness can still linger. Like some of the sweet stories I heard about those unwilling to get rid of some of their clothes for quite some time after the loss, so they could smell the aftershave, if you will. This idea of that lingering aftershave of goodness, of kindness, of what we meant, and the fact that you lift or elevate me, not just when you're watching over my shoulder, but the very thought of you carries with me. And so to that end, as we think back, let me make a couple of different points here. When we're death deniers, that also bleeds over into the fact, I'm looking for a box of Kleenex here, but when somebody begins to cry in our culture, we whip out the disposable Kleenexes like, take this away. I don't want you to feel that sadness, but if you start to cry, what's very likely going to happen to me? I'm going to start to cry. And I don't want to have that happen. So we push away the conversation on death. We push away the tears on that. The very thing that at least it's beginning to suggest in the research that I've been doing, what might actually be a buffer is the fondly talking about this sweetheart. Let me share one great quote. Comes from a fellow. I think that he does a lot of trainings for funeral homes and things around the country. Carl Jennings is his name. And he says, when we recall to the grieving a story that honors their mate, we are at the same time validating their choice of that mate, their commitment to lifelong love, and the worthiness of their shared sacrifices and challenges. So a continuing sustaining of that was a good choice when you said I do, it continues to be something that you do. And we have maybe that power, even outside of the relationship of the ones who've lost love, but those who surround them and try to uphold them by sustaining, that's still a good relationship long after they're gone.
Man, Ron, this is fascinating for me.
We'll be right back after this brief message. And we're back. Well, let's dive right in.
Well, I want to be totally sensitive to this topic because I have not experienced that type of a lot, right? A spouse, even a sibling or a parent yet. Both my parents are still living. But so the closest thing I can relate this to, and it may sound funny to some listeners, but when we lost our dog, okay, so we lost a Yorkie that was 9 years, and every night, Ryan, he slept actually under the blanket with me, right? And it was like a family member in a sense. And when we lost Max, just talking about it, right? I grieved so hard, and then we're longing. Like when I come open the door, he's usually there. When we drop food, from the counter on the floor, we're like, oh, he's usually there doing the dishes. So it was all of this, just all this and this, and his toys there. We didn't want to put his bowl away. All of these things that reminded us of him. Like it's taken months and even years, even to, when I'm mowing the lawn, Ryan, and I drive by where we buried him. Like sometimes I'll get teary because I'll look over and I'll have this just longing, this missing, this grieving of him. And Ryan, when you're talking about some of this, I think I'm guilty of this because sometimes I don't want to look at pictures or things because I know what it will stir in me on my phone. So I in my own life, I kind of push that away because I don't want to look at videos or be reminded because I know, it'll bring up all this sadness, the good times as well. So again, I want to be very, very sensitive because I'm not comparing a dog. It's a loss that is, not comparable to that spouse. But that's the one thing I guess that I can relate to is this real loss. I don't know. Is any of that making sense?
Oh, it absolutely does. I actually had, and it continues to be a principle from the experience that kind of guides and directs some of the things that I do to this day. And it had to do with kind of the hierarchy of grief. Part of what I was asking in my research was, say, for instance, if you were like one of my first interviewed young widows, her husband died of ALS, and she lost him over 9 years from proud, big, strong, healthy guy to someone who couldn't even roll over in bed. She saw it coming from a mile away, if you will, versus I might have left her home and gone and done an interview later that same day with someone who lost their spouse driving to work and having an accident that day, totally unexpected. And we talk about it's like, it's not fair. You got time and you were ready to say goodbye, and I didn't. It's like we created a hierarchy of who deserved to be sadder. And it was actually more punctuated. I backed away from that a little bit because, like you, Janelle is alive and well in our home today, probably out in the garden, living her best life after those rainstorms. I don't understand in that empathetic sense. I think that, cerebrally, like scholarly, I may know a lot more than some of my widows, but I've never been through it. But I was talking about this in one of my undergraduate courses, and after the class was over, and I think you've definitely had this experience as you've taught in so many different spaces, One of the young men waited, and he kind of did one of these. I could tell he wanted to make sure he was alone for what he was about to share with me. And as soon as he turned back to me, his eyes immediately went red and welled with tears. And I thought, following a conversation on death, here this young fellow is going to share his loss and connect with me in this moment. And he did. He choked through his tears and he kind of reached out and he said, you talked about today. And he was touching his heart. It was like he was going to have to gesture most of what he was saying because of the tears choking him up. He said, we just buried my parrot last week. Now, Dave, my gut reaction in that moment was, dude, we're talking about spouses and you're bringing up your bird. Are you kidding me, kid? Immediately, that kind of voice that I think many of us carry around with us, and for many people, it means a lot of different things, but that voice came to me, and it kind of, you know how you can see a lot of information all at once? Those arguments about whose death was worse in the widowed reason and all those things, so much of this just flooded to me immediately. And in my head, in my heart, was this idea of, for what reason would I give order or place or a space in the line to this young man about his grief? Because maybe to that point in his life, that was the hardest thing he had ever experienced. Hardest is hardest. And so as you say what you do, I think it's tender. What you say is right. I think we need to be cautious and conscientious about those around us. But at the end of maybe this comment that I have for you on this as well, what I'm saying doesn't necessarily also say you've got a foist right in front of the individual. You're going to deal with it. You're going to do what Freud talked about. You're going to work through this right here, right now. That's the healthiest way to do it. I wouldn't think it would be a great point to say, if you and I were smile and wave neighbors and you had a significant loss in your life, Dave, that all of a sudden I'm your 5-second hugger coming up to you and just pulling you in close. And we're not going to make weirdness out of what is the process. In the same way, we don't want to forget the loss of the individual to allow for some of that potential buffering that happens from the close and fond memories. We're also not going to force somebody, hey, I heard from Dr. Dunn in a podcast that we're going to shove it down their throat and say, this is the best way to what's next, is for you to stare it in the eye. It's supporting and sustaining people is the invitation, as opposed to avoiding making people sad. Because frankly, take my mom, for instance, after losing my dad. Do you think I ever remind her that dad is gone? Do you think she's like forgotten somehow till I go have lunch with her and then I bring something up and she'd be sad and Ryan, how dare you? Certainly no. So talking to her about the fond memories I see may bring a tear to her eye, but there's a lot of gratitude and fortitude in that great relationship that she forged with him over all those years.
Yeah. Wow. So powerful. Thank you. Helpful for me personally, but I think, for listeners who experience different losses, and people experience them differently. And I think that's important. Not to compare, my loss was greater than your loss, or I lost in an accident. And one had 9 years. I think we can get lost in some of that comparison. Ryan, you've referenced Erikson, right? The idea of intimacy. Maybe first give us a quick snapshot of that. And then how does that framework help us understand why some losses feel so much more destabilizing than others?
Well, not to belabor something that folks aren't paying tuition for. Erikson's lifespan stages of psychosocial development, to me, are pretty fascinating, because you could find somebody at any stage along the way and kind of put some story to it. And he really identified, what is our development in the presence of others, that social aspect of it. I looked at this through the lens of young widowhood. When I was doing the research, most of what I'm referencing to you is around the idea of a regular and expected life stage would be to lose a spouse. And in women, particularly in our culture, but around the world historically, women in a male-female relationship, they outlive their partners for a lot of reasons. Older men tend to marry younger women. There's a reason. Women tends to go to the doctor more often than men do, so men let diseases go further. And men do more dangerous work or fight in wars, etc. So long story short, it's normal and expected to have widows in our society. Of course, there are some widowers. I'm not negating. It's much more common for women to be widowed. But it's normally, as many researchers, Jones in particular, said it's meant to be a late life experience. And I wanted to see, could you take a stage that's regular and expected, but shift it back somewhere else in the lifespan? Would that have a differing impact on a person's development? So I thought about when younger women are married, and we had anybody who was married up through the age of 50. I kind of made a hard stop at 50 years old and said, over that, for this particular study, we weren't looking for your grief scores and your experiences. And looking through the lens of Erikson, that would place them squarely in identity. So like I'm a bride, or I'm Mrs. Jones as opposed to Mrs. Smith, as I took on his name, right? In our culture, that's so common. I'm in an intimate relationship is the very next stage. So identity, intimacy, the one that you and I are talking about mostly. And then, of course, if there were the young parents, the generativity piece. And so I took from Domino and Afonso's work, they created this inventory of psychosocial balance, again, to quantify a construct, to see what is your identity score, what is your intimacy score, what is your generativity score. And in this space, you would find that where people may have had, the proverbial rug pulled out from underneath them, I'm widowed, so am I a spouse or am I not? Intimacy, the person that I want to go home to. I mean, between me and you and the wall, if this is a great experience, I want to run home to tell Janelle about it. If I stumbled all over myself and sounded like a fool on camera, I'm going to run home to tell her about it. Hopefully she'll give me a hug, right? The intimacy piece, like what does that do to these women? And then, of course, generativity, like I said, I was factoring in maybe raising children as a single parent or whatever might make it more difficult. But the identity and the generativity, those two outside pieces didn't have the impact that intimacy did. And intimacy, as it was measuring the closeness of that relationship. Did you have that kind of ride or die individual, the person that was like, the stronger they rated that relationship is what you and I have been talking about a bit today, is this idea that somehow, at least there was a relationship between that and lessening or lowering the scores that they gave themselves in terms of how their grief was going right now. And a quick aside, this is, to me, is fascinating. The research tells us, it's kind of dumb, but it's fascinating. The research, if we look at large numbers of aggrieved individuals and then quantifying how their grief is doing, it tends to say about 2 years out, folks tend to kind of normalize. It's not that the loss or the grieving, the point of the grief goes away, but the scores aren't as impactful anymore after about 2 years, is what you see in the literature. On average, the women that I had in my study, I had approaching 250 in this study, the average time since death, at the time they took the paper and pencil survey, was about 2+ years, Dave. But the scores on their grief was moderate plus. Like, they were still grieving, which puts to bed this idea of 2 years, move on with your life. 2 years, get over it. There's a whole laundry list of things we could say, never say to somebody who's lost a loved one. That would be at the top of the list. I don't see any reason to suggest there's no reason for you to feel grief anymore. Frankly, what we're talking about today probably highlights all the reason you should. It's a reminder of the things that were so wonderful. But even in that conversation, this idea of Erikson's intimacy was something about that bond really is continuing. And it's having, at least to some degree, like I said, it's just scratching the surface, an ongoing impact of my well-being in some of the same ways a really healthy marriage, like you've learned in several of your podcasts with Liz, that a great relationship today is helping individuals to live longer, to have better wealth, to do better at work, etc. It tends to, at least as we're looking at it at this stage, have that impact even after they're gone, which is amazing to me.
Yeah. Along those same lines, Ryan, how does the strength or the intimacy of a relationship shape that grieving process after losing a spouse?
I love this. Well, get a drink of water because hot air dries a person out. David Brooks wrote an article some time ago, and it caught my attention because it was about death and grief, and either I seek them out or people send them to me when they see them. He talked about this idea that in our lives, when heavy-handed things happen, there are firefighters and there are builders. So imagine if we consider a grief or a loss or whatever it is we're talking about is something that burns the proverbial house down. What does a firefighter do? Well, they show up and they blast their hoses and they put out the fire. And then when the fire's put out, where do the firefighters go, Dave? Yeah, they do. They're gone. They're gone from, they took care of the problem, but they're gone. A builder, however, though, comes and looks at an issue, a challenge, a problem. It could be a burned down house. It could be an empty lot. It could be whatever it is. They take time and they methodically put out plans based on the wants and needs of the individual. And then they construct this edifice that then you can go and live in. And certainly the builder goes home at some point, but long after the builder is gone, the sense of their fingerprints in your life or whatever are ever present. And that has touched me. After I read that, having done my work, I thought, David Brooks, you're kind of speaking my language. Again, I'm going to admit a million times to Tuesday that this is just scratching the surface. But if the level of intimacy has the greatest impact on grief levels, and what we were seeing is that the closer they rated their relationship, the less their grief tended to be impacting them at the time that they were writing about it. We think about in what ways, as we're talking about this issue or this item of how is intimacy continuing to impact the individual. It's captured really well a long time ago in Leo Tolstoy's writings. He said, only people who are capable of loving strongly can also suffer great sorrow, but at the same time, the necessity of loving serves to counteract their grief and it heals them. It's like, I still love you. Might cause me to go through a box of tissues because I'm crying about missing you, but that I still love you is an ennobling and empowering and a strengthening factor. At least it seems to be. While partners are together, Gottman says this is like nurturing fondness and admiration. I can speak about my spouse in just geographical terms, being separated from her where we're not in the same space, that I'm fond of her and I admire her for a number of different reasons. And we don't necessarily need to get into those here. But again, like I've talked about earlier, it builds me and strengthens me even when we're not together. It certainly does. And it sweetens the pot for those reunions. Certainly for folks who have a religious bent where they feel like they will see their loved ones again, I could see how that would strengthen it. But Dave, it wasn't only aligned with folks who had a strong religious score in the way that they identified their current set of circumstances. It seems to be that intimacy issue seems to be something that was beneficial to everyone. So this idea of a strong relationship being good for my current physical health and well-being, a strong relationship can continue even out beyond that intimacy, that closeness, out beyond the loss, even including death of an individual.
Yeah, man, this is also fascinating. Ryan, I really like your idea of thinking about relationships almost like emotional estate planning, kind of coming back to some of your finance side. That's such a helpful way, I think, to frame it. What would it look like for couples listening today to actually live with that mindset?
It's a great point. I think as you look at estate planning, if we look at it on a practical level, I sit down with some clients and we draw out, design, dream about the future, and we put it on paper. We could belabor this point, and I certainly will not. We could put legal structure to it. We could get contracts. We could buy life insurance. We could set aside money on a systematic basis for a rainy day. And I think that last one probably hits in one of the most ongoingly important features of great relationships, whether we're anticipating a loss or whether, like me, I have rose-colored glasses, I'm hoping to be with my wife until we're 150 years old, is this idea of the emotional piggy bank. And I know you've talked about that, and you're aware that, you go back to Stephen Covey's work, and he talks about it in terms of both familial as well as business relationships. But Gottman and others have kind of pulled this and said that it's a relational piggy bank. And the kind of things that we do Like when I'm in class, and I've told my students this, I said, I don't advocate you get on the phone and stuff when other people are doing things. And class is certainly a weird place for you to be on your phone as opposed to learning with your classmates and learning with me. But I told them as well, if we're talking about a principle and it reminds me of something that I just really love about Janelle, I'm going to say, hold that thought, everybody. And I'll grab my phone and I'll text her, like an I love you sign language emoji, or I'll just tell her she's hot or something like that. And they giggle about it. But indeed, I'm not doing it to be indecent about texting in class. Well, I'm trying to teach them a principle about if you have a contribution to make to your relational piggy bank, why wait till later? Because A, I forget stuff, not forget how much I love my wife, but I get other things in my life that make it difficult for me to remember. Same reason, take a shopping list to the grocery store. But B, why not give to that individual in the moment that may be good, bad, or ugly for them on the other end of that sharing of what you're doing, that little nudge, little wind in their sails sorts of things. Those are contributions that hopefully later, maybe I'm on a business trip or we're away or whatever, and she feels like, I really would just like a hug right now. She doesn't have one, but she might open her phone and see that, that picture or whatever it is. It's in the account. And then, of course, there's when I stumble and fall and I make dumb choices and things that I need to ask forgiveness for and whatever else. We may need to pull from that piggy bank, but by and large, as we're moving towards the future, just like estate planning, until, setting aside things so where I could live off of them, we're hoping that this emotional piggy bank will work to our benefit if we live to our 65th wedding anniversary. Now, because we're talking about what we're talking about, let's add in one additional wrinkle. What about if we only make it to our 15th, like some of my widows? Dave, I had a gal who had buried 2 husbands by the age of 40, which to me, most people don't even know what that means to do it the first time. And I had an 18-year-old that had already buried her husband, and sweetest stories of what they were able to do with the short time that they had. But I think in life, let's say we're moving along in the regular and expected pattern and things are going well. We have the ups and downs of life. Is it going to be a week in the tropics that's going to really build our relationship to that next level? Or is it going to be the little things that we do over time? I think that the accumulation of those things, and we can talk about this later as well, but the accumulation of those little things in estate planning normally isn't a big drop of money that I'm then set for the future. It's setting aside a bunch so that when the future comes, no matter how grisly that future might be, I've got something to live off. And I think in a similar sense, the relational piggy bank does that for us. So it's, in a sense, it's like that estate planning.
Yeah, I love that. I'm curious then with that kind of those deposits, what are 2 or 3 things right now couples listening can do starting right now today to build a relationship that not only thrives during life, but also provides strength and meaning even after loss, if or when that's going to come?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I could go back through things that you've talked about in past episodes, the books that I've read, the ones that got me through grad school and the ones that I continue to read because I love to just build with my wife. And there's one in particular, and probably there's a couple of copies in that bookshelf back there, but Van Epps' work you're familiar with of How Not to Fall in Love with a Jerk. Title alone is something that people should just carry the book around because it's a conversation starter. He's got a principle in there that's wonderful, and it's not his, other than he gave it this nice alliteration. He said, you need time, talk, and togetherness with each other. So if I think about time, maybe this goes back to that earlier question, is the more time that I have, the better I can utilize the piggy bank of our relationship together. Maybe I'm not as aggrieved. It's not that I'm not sad. It certainly doesn't mean you look at somebody and say, hey, at least you got 60 years together with it. Remember, we don't minimize each other's grief in that. But time with that spouse would allow me to, as Van Epp talks about it in his Schramm model, this idea of I will get to know them and with that knowledge be able to trust or understand that I know exactly what would happen in a set of circumstances. So back to, I think I used the example earlier and I watched a woman kind of stew with this as she had her now teenagers getting ready to graduate, to go on LDS missions, to get married. And she had all these big financial decisions she was going to make. And he had been the money guy in their relationship, which is super common that one spouse is the money person over the other. But in that conversation, she started to well up with tears and these concerns about the future. It's like, I really wish he were here. He makes better financial decisions than I do. I would feel more confident with it. But almost in that moment, she walked back but I know what he'll do. And this is what we're going to do with this graduation and with this marriage and how I'm going to, at what level, help the university student and so forth. And it's almost like it elevated or kind of puffed her up in that moment to feel strongly about something that was hard. So the time together allowed him to do it. The talk, of course, is not just talking at each other. I can talk to my wife about who's going to pick up who from soccer and take to music lessons or whatever it is. But the talk that builds and adds to the piggy bank, the talk that allows us to get to know each other, the Gottman's love maps kind of talk where I know your greatest fears, you know mine, and the first person to be standing at an ovation at the finish line for you is me, and vice versa. We just know we have the talk allows us to connect. So that builds intimacy. And then, of course, the last is togetherness. I'm grateful for the advent of modern technology, but this is something that, and I know they're going to say the older generation complain with the younger generation. Mobile devices, social media, even the fact that we have FaceTime and some of those other things can never replicate this. And I don't have to just say it from my vantage point, even talking with all the military families that I work with and so forth. They love that from how it used to be, we had to wait for a specific time to have a call, to Skype and some of those other things and FaceTime. I can literally talk to them almost every day of the week if I need to now. But from the mouths, right from the horse's mouth, it is not the same as them sitting on the couch down next to me and talking about the same issue with how are we going to pay the bills next month or celebrating the championship, Little League baseball game or whatever it is. Those three, time, talk, and togetherness, how to formulate that in a person's life would be no matter hell or high water comes in their life or you're together till you're both centenarians, they're going to be significant and integral parts of successful relationship.
Yeah, man, I love that. Time, talk, togetherness. It reminds me of something. I don't know if this is the most helpful thing to say or not. This was years ago. So I'm not a counselor, and our listeners know that. That's Dr. Liz. I do more education, but I was in actually a clergy position at this point in my life. And there's a couple, they were struggling. And I often, refer, I've got connections, of course, here at the university. I refer to therapists and counselors. But to this couple, I just felt like saying, if you knew that your partner was going to pass away in 30 days, I said, would you treat them differently? How would you treat them differently if you knew, okay, you have 30 days left? Would you would you talk differently with them? Would you prioritize your time as you're talking about, that togetherness? How would you treat your partner or your spouse differently if you knew, you had 30 days? I just said 30 days, but a set period of time. And you know what? It made him kind of pause, be like, wow, it puts kind of things in perspective and realize people are more important than problems. And I think it helped, at least for a season, to kind of at least shake them for a second and be like, hey, what's most important here? I don't know. Your take on something like that?
I think it's sage advice, those exercises. Because of the work I do, I don't dwell in the macabre part of it of losing Janelle. I will be honest, if she said she was going to be home by 11 and it's 12:30 or whatever because I got stuck in traffic coming back from a game or something, my mind probably does some hamster wheeling that a lot of people's minds don't do. I will grant that. But for the most part, I think kind of like the Tim McGraw, kind of what you're saying, this live like you're dying, is there something? And I'd love to say that I was perfect at it every day. That would be so far from the truth. But this idea of what is most important here, it's like the great old recommendation about washing the dishes or whatever, and you're cussing out the kids because they're not washing them right or whatever. And then they said, chores in the house are meant to bring you closer together. And if they're not bringing you closer together, don't bother doing them. Certainly, when you take a step back, you're like, it's not like we don't clean the house because it's not bringing us closer together. But how do I wash the dishes and come closer together? How do I navigate this financial issue or the fact that I hate your hunting and you hate my shopping or whatever it is, like, but what is the bigger thing that you want through this? Would you treat them or would you speak to them differently? I think that is a great question to make the time, the talk, and the togetherness that we do spend be contributions, donations, endowments into that continue to give gifts long after the experience is over. I like it. I think that's awesome.
We'll be right back after this brief message. And we're back. Well, let's dive right in.
Talk to me a little bit, Ryan. We've talked mainly of loss, of death. There are other losses, as you mentioned, loss of this is a job, or I thought that the professional direction of an athlete. Talked about a pet. I know many of our listeners have been through divorces, separation, divorces, and that may, again, each one is going to be unique because one, it's maybe like, finally, and maybe one didn't see it coming, but even those who kind of finally still have this sense of like, this loss. What do you know? How much do you know kind of about that same type of a loss through a separation or divorce?
That is somewhat out of the tree of my research in that's not where I gathered the data. And I think there would be an interesting wrinkle, and I don't want to walk this and then come around full circle to say, okay, big principles work. Wouldn't depend, doesn't matter what you're talking about. It's kind of like that old adage of, kind of scriptural in nature, faith to move mountains. And then I'll ask students when we're talking about coping and those kinds of things and what different challenges people might be going through. When would this principle work or not? If faith can move mountains, I'm like, how many times have you had to move a mountain? And everybody kind of, when they realize I'm asking them literally to tell me a time that it would have been needful for them to move an actual mountain out of the way, like, well, never. I said, so if it can do that, it probably can do all of these lesser things, right? So maybe I'll try to come full circle with that. But one of the main differences, at least at the stage in grief and loss, and I am keenly interested in all sorts of grief and loss, is to this idea of intimacy. To lose a spouse when you're still in love with them has this kind of persistent impact. For many of those, not all, I just met somebody the other day whose spouse left them and they were still madly in love. For many, the love has been able to grow in a different direction. The accounts into which we've been depositing for quite some time might have been fairly negative, the coins that we're putting in there, if you will, so to speak. So the idea of that being a feature that sustains them thereafter, in all ways but one. And this one came to me in an extraordinarily heavy set of circumstances when I was given the privilege to teach stronger relationship education in an abuse shelter. And it was a uniquely eye-opening experience for me for a couple of different reasons. First, as I walked in to this building, was like hidden in plain sight. I could understand why as I thought about the architecture and the geography of where this was in the middle of town. Like I saw the building, but I didn't realize what it was. It would make sense that not everybody wouldn't want everybody to know what the building was, right? For very onerous reasons. And when I walked in, I'm in a completely mirrored room with a conversation button to talk with folks behind the desk. It's like, why are you here? And I'm so-and-so from Weber State University. I've come to do these healthy relationships classes. And they buzzed me in. And then the second thing, I'm the only man in the building. And within 90 seconds of, my hard head, I'm like, this is a pretty sacred opportunity that you have. Handle it with much care. As I sat down in a room with a bunch of women who had literally fled to this location for their lives. And we were talking about healthy relationships, and one of them called me on it, so to speak, in the middle of what we were doing. And I recognized, I probably need to be more than just the Pollyanna-ish. If we get it right, when we get it right, great relationships do X, Y, and Z for my health, my wealth, my ongoing well-being. And she said, but what if from my grandfather to my father to every single one of my lovers and partners, I've only known what it's like to be a punching bag? And I looked at that woman's face and I realized the difference in life experiences that we all go through. And what she had experienced, I knew I could never understand at the level what she was doing it. Again, we said that voice that comes to you, and it's not yours, but it's gold, comes in and says, ask her if she hasn't gathered in all of her experiences what she does want, not the things that she's running away from for so very good reasons. And I posed that question, and I said, well, I think that we have some pretty clear ideas of what you don't want and what you don't deserve ever in a relationship. Could you tell me some of the things as we're doing this handwriting exercise of what you do want? And she was still angry. She'd been cussing at me and other things like that. And I embraced it. I think there was a good place for me to be able to, as an educator, to allow people to kind of think out loud to stuff that they've never been given the right or the opportunity to think out loud. And it would have been great for her to have a Dr. Liz in her life to be able to process that as therapy. But here, she was like, it was like she raised up to say something, and the question mark caught her. And she thought for a second. And Dave, she went from angry, ready to punch me in the mouth, to tears just welling up in her eyes. And she got a look on her face of, I got you. And she went to writing. And I thought she was going to get tennis elbow. Wrote and wrote and wrote. So even in the losses like those associated with divorce, where all of the dreams in the future may have gone a different direction because we started living our lives in separate ways, and togetherness doesn't feel right, it's not right, or there might be like this gal and all of those in that cadre that were there, not good for you to stay in it anymore. I think the persistence of A, you deserve it, and B, what are you looking for, can, with the listeners, be both an invitation and I was going to say a dare. There's a word in Portuguese that works better, this idea of desafio. It's like an invitation for something that's bigger and outside of this thing that we're talking about. Like when you're a kid and somebody dares you to do a flip on a trampoline or something. It's a dumb connection between the two, but I'm getting this mental picture of how to describe it. Yeah. Does that make sense to your great question?
Yeah, it does. Can you talk even briefly a little bit about the pain of grief and kind of, in the brain and physical pain? You know what I'm talking about? That type of, explain that maybe for listeners so they can understand, and not like deep into the chemistry and all that, but just kind of the principle about it.
Now, grief, and there's a great, if I can find the exact verbiage on this, I'd just like to share it with you, but it talks about the fact that grief is psychological, it's biological, it's psychosocial, it's spiritual, and it's cognitive. I mean, it is really taxing, and we can measure all of those things to then come back to the construct of grief to identify this is different than depression, this is different than sadness, this is different. Like grief is unique in that way. Researchers kind of looked at the idea of pain, and they butted it up against that old playground nursery rhyme, whatever you want to call it, where it's like sticks and stones can break my bones, but names will never hurt me. And really, when they looked at the fMRI images and some of those other things of what lights up in the central nervous system is when individuals feel pain, especially pain associated with loneliness, it lights up the exact same regions of the brain. And all that means, we're not sure, but it lights up the exact same regions as if I kicked you and you experienced physical pain. So really, when we say the pain and anguish associated with grief, it isn't poetry. It's at the same time literal. And for many, I think it's complicating because they'll describe in some of the memoirs that are just so beautifully harrowing in the way that they're written. It's this hold in the chest, the punch in the gut, the I can't breathe kind of feelings. It has those physiological. So for whatever it is, and we're continuing to get to know more about it, this thing that we're calling grief is something that from head to toe, and including outside of yourself, if we include the spiritual aspects and those sorts of things, it's something that has a significant and a painful impact on the individual.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well summarized. Thank you. Just want listeners to remember that, to know that the pain is so real, lighting up the same areas of the brain as physical injury. Yeah, pain to them. Ryan, you've mentioned that you've interviewed, many of these widows. I would love to hear, I don't know, a story, an example, that shows these principles into practice. Do you have something like that?
Oh, absolutely. And it's one that I love. I share it all the time when I'm trying to teach the principle of the magnificence of a relationship, even out beyond death. So before Zoom was trendy because of the COVID shutdown and those kinds of things, I was using it in college because you could record and you could encrypt. And so I'm meeting these women from all across the country by word of mouth as it spread to be able to have these interviews. And one, she's a very colorful individual. She was cussing up a storm while she was sharing the stories with me. Really kind of animated, kind of angry, very passionate, of course, and made total sense to me. I mean, she's talking about her husband that she had lost in the last couple of 3 years. At one point, she stops and she says, Ryan, I'm so sorry about my language and so forth. And I said, hey. I said, I am researching this. Your candor is the most important thing in this story, like how it was for you. And if that's the way to get your points across, I appreciate you sharing these deep things with me. And she said, it's just, how do I put it, Ryan? She said, everyone needs to feel like this. And mind you, we were on Zoom. I do not know, Dave, because I don't remember what my face had done. And she pauses really quickly. She's like, no. I hope that Janelle is not just alive and well in the other room, but for years to come. That isn't what I mean by that. I mean, everyone needs to love that deeply so that when it's gone, it hurts that bad. Mm. And boy, I was grateful for technology, my friend, because I went from taking notes to pondering things of the heart. Like I was stuck in what she had just said and what that might mean to me about the value and the continuation and the strength of and the extension of those strong relationships. It was really something that was just so meaningful.
Wow. Yeah. Stop you like right in your tracks. And one of those things that I guess it just changes your perspective on a lot of things. Brian, that reminds me of, I've got a story. I was trying to think, during this of examples of people who I know who have lost spouses. And I remember one now, actually. So we lived in Missouri for 9 years. I was a professor at University of Missouri. And the friend group that we had out there, it really was like family. We'd spend holidays and things together. And this couple, his wife, I believe they'd been married around, 17, 18 years. They had 3 children. I think the oldest was about 13 and maybe 10, and then about 7 or 8 years old. And his wife went through cancer, and it was in remission, and then it came back with a vengeance in the brain. It's just sad to see them go downhill. We had kind of one last time where just the friends, we all got together and did things, and she was in a wheelchair. We knew she didn't have much longer. And then he knew that I talked on marriage and things. And after she passed, and I'm looking at a picture on my screen here of all the friends together at the funeral. And then he said that I could share this. And so I share this in presentations, but I think it really resonates with our topic today. And he says this is a quote. He says, there have been many times over the past year when I would be contemplating our scenario and I would feel not just guilt, but disappointed in myself for all the trivial things we would argue about. I wish I would have been more proactive about doing things for her, not just helping with chores around the house, but doing things that would let her know she was special. We had a great marriage, best friends, but it's so easy to get caught up in everyday life and forget to do those things that really matter. And I just feel like, wow, doing those things for each other that really matter, making sure that she knows that she is special. I'm curious. Let me ask you this. If someone listening, were to lose their spouse tomorrow, what would you hope they could say about the relationship they built? And how do we start building that kind of relationship today for those who are living?
Well, it's an extension of that great story and quote you shared from your friend. I actually, at the end of many of my interviews with my widows, in talking to them what they had now been through, I said, okay, you're a veteran now. And that usually get a little chuckle or at least a little side smile out of them. I said, what if your best friend, your sister that's close to you, whatever, called you later today and heaven forbid, said I lost him in the car accident or whatever it was. He's not coming home. I said, knowing what you know now, like, what would you do? And to some degree, the question you've asked me is not that, but it aligns, because the very first reaction of every single one of them, Dave, was, oh, I have no idea. I don't know that there is a perfect. And I think if we can get that out of our minds, it kind of aligns really nicely with Pauline Boss's work when she says closure is a myth. So as soon as you can get rid of the fact that there's anything you were going to say or you were going to do which is going to make it perfect, then you can get on with the real action or activity of life, right? But within that, the real action and activity of life, if you will, like what you just shared out of that quote, I think is a beautiful thing. When those women, after thinking about it for just a quick moment, those widows would commonly then just say, you know what? I would go over and I would see a need and I would fill a need. If the garbage can needed to go out to the street, if the dishes were in the sink, I wouldn't ask, hey, I'm here. What can I do for you? Because in the fog of all of that loss, or in the heaviness of life and the way that it is, people commonly don't know the answer to that question. So just don't ask, just do. Assume you are a person that's okay to be in their kitchen washing dishes, right? Don't be weird about it. We've talked a little bit about that before, but I believe from the time that we're talking about right here, right now, it's very Buddhist of me to say this, but the past is obviously something I should learn from. In the future, I really can't do a whole lot about it in particular, but I can build, like what Bowlby said, Bowlby and Ainsworth in those attachment theory conversations, a secure base. And the way that I do that is like my neighbor right now across the street is pouring the foundation in his home. It's doing those parts. He dug first, he laid gravel next, and then he bought and paid for it and brought in the cement. They poured it and they formed it and they smoothed it. Like the work of the day-to-day, instead of calling it a secure base, call it a secure bank, if you want to kind of dovetail it into what we've been talking about, to make those daily contributions. If you're listening to this and you're thinking to yourself, I've been a little lackluster, I can align my thoughts here with what Dave just read from his friend. Pause the show, or if you're watching it with somebody who's meaningful to you, go and give them a hug. Text them the I love you or whatever, a meme or something. Make a contribution in that today. And then, like my kids who can't give up a streak on their social media apps and things like that, do it tomorrow, do it the next day, and then don't break the streak. We're going to be imperfect and we're going to make messes, but control what you can by right now loving them, hugging them, holding their hand, both literally, yes, of course, but also figuratively. Check in after that doctor's appointment or that interview. How did it go? And if they need something from you, don't necessarily try to fix it. Hear them out, unless they want you to fix it and then do it. Meeting them where they are, but doing little things day in and day out. When they look back and they can say, we never scaled Kilimanjaro together. We never spent 2 months in the Caribbean like we had thought about, and we certainly never had $1 million in the bank. But my best friend, and I knew it, and they knew it, and nobody outside of us would ever deny it. I think that's the kind of relationship people would look back on fondly, and is probably at least part and parcel of what we're talking about in terms of it would be meaningful, even in including the loss of that individual through death.
Man. We'll be right back after this brief message. And we're back. Well, let's dive right in.
So powerful, my friend. This has just been such a, I don't know. And I think it's deep and it's an important discussion, something we haven't been talking about on the show that I think will really resonate with people. Before, as we kind of wrap up this, I'm curious, people who want to learn more about your work or dive deeper into this topic, books, helpful resources, things that we can put in the show notes. Where can they go? What resources do you recommend?
Well, if you wanted to kind of be a nerd about it, you could look at my dissertation, which is the long form of maybe 2 or 3 studies that will come out in the next couple of years that I suggest those will be more palatable. They'll be more digestible. Mm-hmm. my hope is to extend that to more. Can I hand this over to somebody who's not another academic reading it? Yeah, that Young Widow's Grief that I wrote, it's been better part of 10 years now, is a place you could look at it from an academic lens. But there are some other things that I've noticed since doing that work, is I've kind of steeped myself in the principles here to hear it through the lived experiences of others. And there's some great memoirs out there. Ones that come to mind as you ask the question is like Sheryl Sandberg. She has this great book, and it's called Plan B, maybe Option B, but it's the idea of when she lost her husband at a young age and being in the C-suite at Facebook at the time, she kind of journaled out loud to everybody else about what she was going through and the messiness of it all and so forth. But principles about, how that relationship was meaningful to her, but what she could do to live and move on with that grief in tow, not move on from that grief. That's powerful. Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking, I think, is a classic one that comes out, which is a heavy one to read. But side by side, we're talking about like the estate planning aspect of it, the things that you do today that benefit tomorrow. So when you look at the things that you and Liz have been doing and looking down the principles of Gottman, Van Epp, and Love and Stasny, how to improve your relationship without talking, a great book, and reading about Sue Johnson's work or Levine and Howell, right? Or going back to the classics and understanding at whatever stage of life you're in, what's the best ways to live healthier and happier. Those are all things that I think that a piece at a time, we build our strengths and our abilities. And as we practice those, we bring our relationship into what we're learning, and we elevate. We elevate the experience today, and heaven forbid if we need it. But for most of us, we're not going to need it I buried somebody at age 35, like we've been talking about. Even in including talking to my 80-plus-year-old mother, the fondness and admiration she has for my dad just carries her, and it's a beautiful thing to watch, even in including through those tears. A real estate plan. His finances are taking care of her, but their relationship, Dave, that's really what's carrying. So looking at those things and doing those things today, I think is maybe easier than we might consider in somewhat of a complicated conversation on death and grief.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks, Ryan. Hey, as we wrap up, we like to ask all of our guests a couple of questions. The first one, what do you feel like is the key? Maybe not the key, but a key to a stronger marriage connection?
Looking through all the principles and building kind of what you need where you need it is always going to be important. So I'd be remiss to not say, looking back over the 100 many episodes, the different principles you've highlighted through those guests, those are core ingredients. So always learning. I mean, how much time do I spend in the gym to be physically fit? How much time do I go to continuing education to build my career? How much time do I watch what I eat or whatever? And I think for various people, but there's going to be higher and lower measures on all of those things. But how many of us are spending any time, let alone much time, to build the most important thing that will last longer than my career? And apparently, from what I'm researching, longer than my life. Like, am I putting effort into that? So the Gottman-based principle of little things often, I will write sometimes on the chalkboard or the whiteboard, and I'll write down a lot of little things. And then I'll just turn around and I'll ask the class, I'll ask the group, what is that? And they'll look at me like, what do you mean? And it's like, well, forgive the handwriting, but what is that? And they'll say a lot of little things. I said, it's a lot. And I circled a lot. I said, it doesn't have to be the big $1 million gift. It doesn't have to be the house on the hill. It doesn't have to be the trip. It doesn't have to be. What becomes a lot is, so I think the key, the core, maybe that Ryan takes away from this, and he wants to live a better life steeped in what he is, what I'm sharing with you today. I think that's at the core of many keys that we could be talking about.
Yeah. Amen, my friend. Yeah. Love that. And finally, what's a takeaway of the day? Just, man, from all the things we've been talking about, what's the take-home message that you hope our listeners will remember from our discussion?
Don't put off to tomorrow what you can do today. And I know that's something that you might have on your mirror, your refrigerator, or whatever, and it could get cliche. But like when I'm texting in my class with my students, if I'm feeling it, I want to share it with Janelle. That's an important feature of our relationship. And you don't have to copycat me. I think everyone can find their own way of doing that. But the point is we're living lives together in parallel. Oftentimes, like you're going through one thing, I'm going through something, and it happens to be, whatever o'clock on a Monday morning. I get that, but what about this idea of when we've made a we in a relationship, we are living it together, even and including when we're separated by geography, which is the more common, but we're bringing into the viewers today's, or the listeners today's lives, even when life separates us. Don't put off, because I don't want to be macabre, and I'm not casting this on anybody like you're going to lose them. But what if you did? The coulda, shoulda, wouldas can be awfully painful, but as we're saying, the piggy bank can be awfully powerful.
Oh, man. Just gave me chills, my friend. This is what a great discussion. This has been so unique. My takeaway, I echo what you're talking about. I come back and I look at this quote on my screen. I wish I would have been more proactive about doing things for her, not just chores around the house, but letting her know that she was special. Don't forget to do those things that really matter. And it is just intentional effort, because the natural person in us is just kind of drifts. We just kind of drift. It's the law of least effort, I call it. We just kind of give the minimum to kind of get through each day and then do it again tomorrow. But man, yeah, intentional little things, that a lot of little things. I often love that, Ryan. Can't thank you enough, my friend, for making time to come on, to share so much. Deep, important, like the core of who we are type of stuff. So already this has just been an episode to remember. So genuinely appreciate you for coming on.
Yeah, it's been great. And again, you and I talked about this earlier, but even preparing for this reminds me of who I want to be, not just for Janelle, but as in general. So it is a pleasure to invigorate some of my own thoughts on things that we've been learning for quite some time.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, feeling it, my friend. All right, friends, that does it for us. We will see you next time on another episode of the Stronger Marriage Connection podcast. And Liz is not here, so I'll say her line. Remember, it's the small things done consistently that create a stronger marriage connection. See you.
Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, do us a favor and take a second to subscribe to our podcast and the Utah Marriage Commission YouTube channel at Utah Marriage Commission, where you can watch this and every episode of the show. Be sure to smash the like button, leave a comment, and share this episode with a friend. You can also follow and interact with us on Instagram at Stronger Marriage Live and Facebook at Stronger Marriage. So be sure to share with us which topics you loved or which guests we should have on the show next. If you want even more resources to improve your marriage or relationship connection, visit strongermarriage.org, where you'll find free workshops, e-courses, in-depth webinars, relationship surveys, and more. Each episode of Stronger Marriage Connection is hosted and sponsored by the Utah Marriage Commission at Utah State University. And finally, a big thanks to our producer, Rex Polanis, and the team at Utah State University, and you, our audience. You make this show possible. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the Utah Marriage Commission.